number of ways these things can present themselves is practically infinite. I mean, I've had really weird experiences with information. For instance, you know these flashers on buildings where the news goes by? I've had hallucinations where it became a textual hallucination. In other words, what I was seeing was an illuminated page of print, and then as I looked at it, every 50th letter would invert, and then suddenly every 20th, and then every 10th, and then every 5th, and I literally watch a page of text go from being readable to being gibberish, and then watch the meaning come through again in a loop. I mean, I think anything you can conceive of, it can do, and many things you can't conceive of.
That's the beauty of individual perception. I mean, we're all individuals. We all have the gift of bringing our own ideas.
But still, you have to be able to make general statements about it, or you would have to say that it's all and everything.
But if it was exactly the same, it would be boring.
Well, although how would you know, since you would never have any trip but your own?
Right.
One of the things that happens on psilocybin and on ayahuasca that really puzzles me, that I just go back to again and again, is you can be having these volleys of hallucination, and then you can say to it, Art Deco, and click, and suddenly there will be thousands of cigarette lighters, limousines, candy dishes, stuff rolling in black space in front of you. Thousands of these things perfectly exemplifying this very narrowly defined aesthetic domain. Italian Baroque, click, altarpieces, saints with their eyes rolled back, dripping gold, the whole thing. And so you say, boy, that is really strange. We click through aesthetic epochs like points on a dial, but then you can say to it, surprise me. In Baroque, not Empire, not dynastic Egypt, not North American Indian, Maya, or Fujiwara Japanese, but something never seen on this planet, but equally coherent as those other styles. And I always think, my God, if I could just grab hold of this, I would be Yves Saint Laurent or Klimt or somebody like that. The mushroom has a personality. And like all personalities, it excludes some things and includes others. The mushroom personality is a radically eccentric personality. The mushroom talks about transforming the planet. It says, I come from a distant part of the galaxy. I have 500 million years of galactic history in my databanks. I have seen 50,000 worlds come into existence and pass out of existence. I've seen ships the size of Australia depart for Andromeda. I've seen this, I've seen that. And it's willing to show you the newsreels of it. That kind of and it says, your world is ending. Put your furry paw into my hand, and together we will march out to the stars. It's this dun, 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 dun. Well, so then you take a compound or a shamanic hallucinogen like ayahuasca. Chemically, this is very, very similar to DMT. Experientially, it could hardly be more different. Ayahuasca does not show you images of enormous machines in orbit around alien planets and that sort of thing. Ayahuasca, first of all, it doesn't speak. It shows. You become like the eye of a camera, flying through a world. And what it shows you, it's much more feminine. It shows you water flowing over the land. It shows you plant life growing and dying. It shows you the movement of glaciers over the surface of the land. It shows you people burying their dead. It shows you archaic civilizations. It shows you women nursing their children. It shows you meat. It shows you the stuff of this world on every level. And it moves you to tears. I mean, it's emotive. It's not about our cosmic destiny out there in the starry blackness. It's about coming to terms with the earth and our past. I mean, I've seen states of group-mindedness that were so specific that there was no possibility that what was not happening was no shit, one-on-one, real-time telepathy. Take me to your leader. No, I did have one DMT trip way back, like maybe the second or third or fourth way back, where it was completely different. It's the only one I've ever had like that, and it was completely different. And the way I put it to myself was the big people were home. And it was an entirely different feeling. And many people, actually, I've never quite had this myself, but many people report DMT trips where they break in on an entity who is not pleased at all and demands to know how the hell you got there. And it's this, who are you? And then various sorts of dialogues go on, and one person described being then just hurled through all of time, like exploded back from this thing and going through all the recapitulation of ontogeny, and it's weird stuff. DMT trips, I mean, mine are always as I described, but some people report, and these may be synergies with antidepressants or something like that, but apparently very stable and strange worlds. I mean, worlds with alien peoples and animals and cities and, very science fiction-y stuff. That's why this Bell's theorem, I don't think we use that word, but this non-locality that we talked about may have something to do with the phenomenon of the imagination. Like, it's occurred to me over the years that what we call imagination might simply be hyperdimensional perception, and you're actually seeing worlds and places that truly exist somewhere scattered through the galaxies like grains of sand, but no place you will ever contact or visit in the flesh, but that the data is somehow present. There seems to be some kind of tuning thing that needs to go on. Possibly with technology. I had a really weird experience years ago. I took LSD one evening with a bunch of people, and it was fairly casual and social, and smoked a bunch of weed, and this went on for a couple of hours, and it didn't really ever seem to come on, or it just seemed to be very light. And then I climbed on my motorcycle and went home and decided I would go to bed, and I decided that I would smoke one last joint before going to bed. And I had one of those stand-up electrical resistance heaters that you get in at the Salvation Army, if you're a poor student. And I said, so I turned it on as I started to smoke this joint, and it was badly wired, and it made this sound like, and as I began to listen to this sound, I went to lizard land. And I entered into this completely coherent thing which lasted for hours about this world inhabited by these intelligent reptilian beings. And we went through their art, their history, their theories of jewelry making, their philosophy, their polity, their science, their religion, their fashion, and it was like endless stuff about this very specific reptilian world. Well, then later I tried again. I took LSD with my arm around my heater and had by then been preaching it in the streets. But this was and I could never really find my way back, which is a typical phenomenon of higher dimensional phase space. Ralph taught me, doing the reverse of what you did doesn't steer you back to where you started. You have to find your way forward through the matrix. Kat and I were in the Amazon in '76 taking ayahuasca. We got in with this certain group of people in Peru that took it every week. And, you know, cultures have different ways of handling hassle. And in some cultures it's confrontational, in other cultures not. The way these Peruvian country folk operated was if somebody was screwing up, nobody would ever say so. They would just talk about these people behind their back until the morphogenetic field of gossip was so strong that you would basically awaken to the problem. So there was a complex social situation going on in this ayahuasca circle, which was there was a master shaman who we were apprenticed to, who was beloved by his neighborhood. But he had a nephew, a sobrino, who was a jerk. I mean, this guy was, as Don Fidel said, ambitious. He dealt a little weed, he did a little pimping, he was just sort of an edge runner type of guy. And every Saturday night we would all get together and take ayahuasca, about 30 of us. Older shamans, our guy, people from the neighborhood, and this sobrino, Don Jose. So, I don't know what the real history of it was, because I had just arrived on the scene, but these old guys would sing these icaros, these magical songs on ayahuasca that appear as colored tapestries in front of your eyes. And, you know, they had soul, they were into it, and this guy would sing against them. I mean, it's the rudest thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, imagine if you know, Lou Reed were trying to give a performance and the guy in the third row just launched into Old Man River and kept at it, you know. I mean, in this town, I'm sure large guys would appear and say, "Sir." In Peru, it didn't work like that. They just kept singing. He kept singing. And it was clear that this is how it was going to be handled, that we had just divided into two separate entities here. Well, my wife was sitting next to me, and he was sitting across the room from us, the sobrino, and I had been watching him for a long time, and I was loaded to the gills, and I could see he would get up on his haunches, and he looked like a monkey. His face... it was uncanny. I mean, he looked like a monkey, and he also looked kind of like a jackal, a dog with long teeth. He kept going through these changes, and Kat leaned over to me and said something like, "This guy is an asshole." And I just said, you know, let it slide. What do we know? Think of it as anthropology. But she wasn't having it. So after a while, he kept doing this. And at one point, and everybody in the room, every person in the room was bummed out, and they were looking at their laps. All eye contact was broken. It's actually, when I was a kid, I invented a word. The word is fardao, and it means the embarrassment you feel when someone else fucks up. You know, and you happen to just be there, but somehow the aura of it is so strong. So the entire room is just awash in fardao, and the old guys are singing, and the guy is singing. So then at the end of a particularly intense clash of these two styles, my wife just looked across the room at this guy and like put the whammy on him. And I saw these red arrows leave her eyes and like dotted lines go across them. And they moved fairly slowly, you know, more slowly than you could throw a ball or something. Well, when this line of red arrows got to this guy, he was knocked off his feet. He fell backwards with his legs in the air, and there was a big noise. And all the singing stopped, and everybody in the room looked up, and these three old shaman who were sitting behind Don Fidel, who I, to that point, had not heard speak any language but Quechua, one turned to the other and he says in Spanish, "Oh, the gringa sends the zabura." The girlfriend in the other dimension, the mushroom, once I said to her, I said, "What should I call you?" And she said, "Call me Dorothy." So I invoke it, and it comes, and then we're off. And sometimes it's easy and loving, and sometimes it's different. I remember one very epic trip I had where I had tossed out a big compost pile from growing mushrooms years ago in another country. Actually, it was a past life, I'm now recalling. But anyway, I tossed out this stuff, and this thing grew, this humongous mushroom. And I had taken mushrooms the previous Saturday. I had taken a full dose, which is 5 dried grams. So I thought, I want to take mushrooms again this Saturday, but I think I may have picked up a tolerance. So I'll just take 9 grams instead. And this is where the learning takes place. The mistakes, treasure your mistakes. So the thing, it's like I'm sitting there and suddenly I realize, oh my God, it's coming at me. It's 100 miles wide, it's 10 miles high, and it's just rolling toward me. It looks, and I barely had time to lay down. That's how fast. I said, and a voice said, prepare, the storm is about to hit the beach. And I laid down, and it was like a tornado hitting. And at one point I opened my eyes, and there was this woman in a full bondage getup with piercings and rubber panties and the whole thing, and I was lying there between her legs. She was standing upright, and she put her face right down next to mine, and she said, "Is it strong enough for you, asshole?" To which I replied, "Yes." And then she said, "They say it helps to close your eyes, cowboy." And I later, in thinking about that trip, I realized the reason the mushroom addressed me as cowboy is because that's most people mushrooms have met have been cowboys and cowgirls, because they're the people who follow the cows. And most people have encountered this thing in the pasture. Maria Sabina, the mushroom shamaness of Oaxaca, claimed not to have been initiated. She claimed that as a child left to watch the sheep and the cows, she had been hungry and had gotten into eating mushrooms. Once I was in India and I was cornered. This guy, I was loaded actually on mescaline, and this guy swam aboard my houseboat. And normally I just would run these guys off because they were thieves and beggars. But I was so loaded that I couldn't do anything but sit there. And this guy came up to me and sat down across from me and looked at me. And after a few minutes he said, "Face is index of mind." And I said, "Ranji, I can't be interrogated now." But it was this thing. He could see, face is index of mind. My mind was swirling visibly there. At times appeared to work miracles. At one point I was trying to test him and his abilities, and I recalled that there was a box that my grandfather had given me that you opened with a little silver key that had been lost for years and years. And I said, "Well, if you can do anything, why don't you produce the key that to that box, which neither of us had seen even the box for a dozen years. By this time, he was naked and locked in a room at the mission. And he went and he would make these bizarre gestures, these strange, I don't know what was going on. And he went into a period of concentration, gave a wild squawk, and slammed into my hand and gave me the key. Gave me the key. He was naked. He had been locked in this room for 14 days at that time. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening to me was, I was like utterly unconcerned for his mental health or any practical concern, which was causing a lot of problems for the other people on the expedition. In classical psychology, this is called a folie à deux, a delusion of two. It's a simultaneous schizophrenic episode. It usually involves a mother and a daughter. I've never heard of a brother-brother folie à deux. But it was accompanied by all these exterior manifestations, freak rainbows, and in my case, an encounter with a UFO. And this UFO encounter had a very curious quality to it. Not that they don't always, I suppose. But this was even more curious than the pedestrian UFO encounter. What happened was, it was on the 13th day of the reversal, and I had this intimation. There was something going on about the Southwest. I wasn't clear quite what it was, and the two women on the expedition were that afternoon washing our clothes down by the Choro, by the lake, and I looked across the lake and I saw in the sky not a rainbow but just a spot in the sky that was a spectrogrammatic diffraction, you know, a little patch of rainbow. And I asked the women if they saw it, and they said they didn't. And then it intensified. And by this time, I was plenty in the doghouse as well. I mean, this put a great deal of strain on our small party, as you can imagine. And this spectrogrammatic iridual intensified. And then I said to them, now do you see it? And they looked, and they said, oh, yeah, it's, you know, big deal, not much, but I knew, and knowing means the voice was speaking to me. All kinds of weird things went on. I mean, I discovered that the closer I was to water, the easier it was for me to rhyme, which I've never. And then years later, I encountered a Celtic saying, "Poetry is made at the edge of running water," and the thing would give me these aphorisms. Like one time, it said, "The clone's load is a stoned mode," and you know, and I was not sleeping. I was now 11 days without sleep. So that night, I decided to sit by the Choro and just. Because I stayed up all night, and I would walk in the fields, and the thing would would connect up the constellations for me and show me where they were in the sky. There was also embedded in all this thing the intimation of this thing called the teacher, which was a giant insect-like thing that was always like right over here. And there was the sense of something watching us from the sky, something moving us very, very gently but persistently toward this very weird breakthrough. What I hear you asking is, what about the dark side of psychedelics? And I think that's certainly worth talking about. It isn't a joyride necessarily. One thing that is quite wonderful about psychedelics is that, and I'll just speak of the mushroom in this case, is that it's wonderfully kind to beginners. But if you are an acolyte of the priesthood, sooner or later it will scare the socks off you. And in many ways it can do this. In fact, that's what's so scary about it, is it knows the way to scare you, just like it knows everything else about you. And so in my talk I stressed the facility with which one can access these places, and I sort of teased yoga. It is easy to access these places. The question is then, but is it easy to control and manipulate and understand these places? And this is where it can turn you every way but loose. This is where you want to have your mantras polished and your yantras ready, because in that domain it all works. All that malarkey that doesn't ever work anywhere else, in that domain it works. And so I think one should have techniques, the ring pass not, or mantras, something that you have faith in, power objects. Ultimately, the best advice I've ever come on, and it's pretty sickening advice, but the goal is to survive these things, is Frank Herbert's advice in Dune about fear. And he says, fear comes like a wind. It comes. And the way you meet it is you meet it. And you wait, and it blows, and it blows, and it blows itself out. And then you're alone again. And that's what you have to do. And then in terms of practical instruction, there are ways to navigate through hard spots. Breath control, singing. Singing is wonderful. We tend to suffer silently. And if you get into a pressurized place on a psychedelic, I don't think it's a good idea to go to squeeze down and to meet it like that. I think it's much better to sing, to circulate huge volumes of oxygen through your body and just send your whole metabolism spiraling off in some other direction. Shamanism was defined by the foremost commentator on it, Merciliade, as the archaic techniques of ecstasy. Notice its techniques. And this is really important. This is not a religion or an ontology or a set of beliefs like Buddhism, Hinduism, Catholicism, you name it. It's a set of techniques. And the techniques deliver the experience. And then out of the experience one creates whatever models of the universe seem appropriate. But this is what science was before science. This is what religion was before religion. And it's deep. It's the deepest thing there is. Our society, living in ignorance of this, is infantile and destructive and narcissistic and materialistic and the whole gamut, because we can't touch the gold in life. It's hard for us. It's very elusive. It's far from us. Authenticity is fleeting, and we require psychotherapists and self-affirmation and all this stuff to hang on to it. How I got into this, like the gentleman who asked the question, is by being in the Amazon, by having searched India to see, what can you show me? And they couldn't show me anything. They wanted me to sweep the ashram for 12 years, and then something wonderful was going to happen. But then when I got to South America, I said, what can you show me? And this guy said, let's sharpen our machetes. We'll go out here and get some of this snake vine and come back, and I'll show you. And by 10 o'clock that night, I was sobbing in the guy's arms. He'd shown me. I was a convert. I'd sweep his courtyard for 12 years without asking.
My daughter, who I haven't seen for a while, is coming today, and it caused me to think of an incident that happened to she and I years ago here at Esalen. And it's a story which makes no sense whatsoever, but it really, truly happened, as far as I can tell. But it has all the qualities that bedevil this kind of thing. And what it was I was, as I am now, scholar in residence. It must have been some 10 years or so, 8 years or so ago. So Clea would have been like 9, and I would have been 40. So we were both younger and more naive. And it was dinner time at the lodge, and it was this time of year and this time of weather. And the fog had been coming all day in and out in the garden. And it was, and we genuflect here, God love him, to Carlos Castaneda, it was that very strange time of day, which only lasts a few minutes, between daytime and nighttime, the crack between the world, I believe. It's interesting in South America and also in Hawaii, at precisely that moment, every day there are certain species of Lepidoptera that rearrange themselves. In other words, that come out from wherever they've been hiding for 24 hours, fly around furiously for 5 minutes, and then disappear again for 24 hours. But anyway, it was precisely that time of day, and the fog was coming in and out of the garden, and we were not in a mood for anything peculiar. We were intent on dinner, and we were walking the path through the garden, and suddenly, as this fog moved and cleared, coming down one of the rows was a bunny, a small rabbit, except that it had very small, short horns. Now, some of you may know the creature called the jackalope. The jackalope is a large jackrabbit with a pair of antelope horns, and it is a creature known only to exist above certain low-class bars scattered across California and Oregon. It's up on the wall, the jackalope. It's something you kid tourists with. As far as I could see, this was a baby jackalope about this high, and it crossed the trail no more than 5 feet in front of us. We both saw it, and our attitude was not amazement or an awareness that we were entering into a paranormal dimension. Both of us, I think our reaction was, come on. And then immediately behind it was a man, a very thin, not particularly healthy-looking man with a shaved head, wearing something like a gray running suit. And he was running crouched. He was with his hands out like this. He was trying to catch the jack-a-bunny. And when he saw us, he appeared very confused and stood up and turned and walked the other way. And I just took her by the elbow and I said, let's get out of here. And then we went to dinner, and we've talked about it immediately after and since. And as far as anybody can reasonably and decently tell, this is the straight story on what happened. Well, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the earth doesn't move from its pinions. But what does it say? It says that attention falling into a certain place of non-attention is set up for something like this to happen. And I can't explain it. I don't think it's explainable. It's sort of like, when you study quantum physics and they tell you that a black hole mostly puts out electrons, but the theory allows that it could eject Miatas and grand pianos, except that it would be very rare for it to eject a grand piano. But the theory does not preclude the ejection of grand pianos. So it's something like that, or it's a group hallucination, or it's a bewitchment, or, and it begins to proliferate. I was thinking about it last night or this morning, because I was in that place where I saw it happen. I was thinking, maybe Esalen lasts a really long time. Like maybe it's sort of like the Piazza San Marco in Venice, or the Central Aryan Stonehenge. Maybe we're actually starting something here that will last so long that for the next 5,000 years, people will relate to the Esalen Garden, and that somehow it's a nexus for others on strange missions. Now, the other thing about that story that I like, or that relieved me, is I guess the way to put it, is notice that it's absurd. And by being absurd, it's self-canceling. Suppose instead of a jackalope, which is an absurd creature to begin with, suppose it had been a gray of the wraparound eye type that are apparently trading high technology to the government for human fetal tissue, those people, then you would have had a real dilemma on your hands, because grays are objects of cultural fascination. In other words, if you see a gray, you just become part of a statistical body of people who've seen one. And so it's like more problematic. It's not that it's a non-reality, it's that it's a sort of a non-reality. This is, I think, part of the clue to understanding alien abductions and the way we generate information. If I tell you that I was up late last night and couldn't sleep and walked along the cliffs over Esalen, and that I encountered a shining disc, and that I then had my navel lint was removed by a team of extraterrestrial cosmetologists, this is evidence for an already existing body of data. If you say, well, you should call MUFON, they'd be very interested in this, or you should call somebody else. If I tell you I was restless last night and walked the cliffs of Esalen, and that I encountered Bugs Bunny in the company of Patrick Swayze, people would just say, you're nuts. It's not sanctioned. It's not allowed. And nobody gives a hoot or takes it seriously for a moment, because it serves no one's agenda. It's just insane data and should be immediately tossed out. This shows us, that the objects in the unconscious are given different weights, and you can tell a crazy story and join a self-help group, but if your story is too crazy, they won't have a group for you, they'll have a cell for you. So it's worth bearing in mind. Let's be generous here. Someone had prepared a bunny with horns to surprise someone else with whom they'd had a lifelong running joke about jackalopes. And they had arrived at Esalen for the surprise birthday party of this person and realized that the bunny was frantic because it hadn't eaten on the long trip. So they took the Jackabunny in its cage down to the garden to steal some lettuce for it. And in the fog and in the effort not to be seen, the bunny escaped with its horns in place, and this person, who probably didn't have a gate pass anyway, could see the whole situation getting out of hand and was frantically trying to capture the horned bunny and get it back in its... See people saying, gee, what a party pooper this guy is. Well, yeah, but we're trying to save the laws of physics and reason here, for crying out loud. But I have to tell you, that doesn't feel right to what it is. It felt to me like, I don't know, we all live in private Idahos. And somehow I was in somebody else's private Idaho for a moment against my will. But I think we should always prefer the simplest explanation. Sometimes the simple explanation, like in a case like that, is maddeningly complex in itself. But if you don't believe that's what's happened, well then what do you believe? Do you believe that mythological animals are a potential infestation problem in the Esalen Gardens? Or just where do you draw the line? I had an experience earlier this summer, which I probably shouldn't tell, but I will, that is an example of how it gets weird. A friend of mine moved to London and left me his library for unspecified amounts of time to keep. A very bizarre library, mostly Platonic stuff, a lot of magic, a lot of that sort of thing. And so we built a book loft for it, and our house is wedge-shaped, and so this book loft is way up at the top of the house. And I was alone in the house, and I took 7 dried grams, and I was sitting there, and it was just beginning to come on. I was in the show what you know thing phase, and it was beginning to show what it knew, and there was this disrupted area of space in front of me where it was like rotating, and I was looking into it and talking it up. And I was actually speaking. At first, I was just speaking in my mind. Then I began speaking aloud, and I was saying, "You are beautiful thing. You are beautiful." And suddenly, things changed, and it became very cold, and meaning the temperature fell suddenly. And the dog next door, who never howls, howled. And the cat, which was down below me, I was up in this loft looking down at our bed. The cat was on the bed. The cat flared out and made this really weird noise. And I just, I stopped what I was doing and projected my mind into this situation. And at that moment, I heard this sound, which was like... And then something settled onto the roof, sufficient to make the 6 by 14-inch beam creak in. Just went... And I was floored. And I just sat for a minute, and I was not frightened. In fact, my emotion was hard to get back to, but I wasn't frightened. But just at that moment, this thing was really coming on and really visually peculiar. And it seemed like the two things were independent. The trip was getting stronger and stronger, but a 10-ton something had landed on the roof beam of my house. So I just sat with it for about 30 seconds, and then this thought or voice came, and it was this thing has come because of something I'm doing, and that means that I can get rid of it. So I just turned like this up toward the roof and projected this thought very strongly, which was, "Begone, I am in conversation with an elder." And this thing went, "Whoa!" And there was a long pause, 10 seconds or so, and then whatever it was, it lifted off the roof and went away. And what was weird about this was I had never ever used in my own mind this phrase, "an elder," to describe the mushroom. It was like just came out of me. And the whole episode seemed real weird to me. And I just let it ride. But that's an instance where, there is this, let's call it synchronicity, so that we don't have to believe that a pterodactyl landed on my roof. There is this synchronicity. For some reason, there chose to be a fluttering sound and the beam chose to creak. Now, doubtless this has to do with temperature and the cooling of day to night and this and that. But, it was a thing to go through. There is something loose on this planet, is that what I want to say? Or behind reality? Or something? We could call it the unconscious, but that might make you feel more comfortable with it than you should. But what this power can do is it can manipulate your mind. And what it has access to is the complete contents of your experience. It has more access than you do. You, the ego, are a fragile and forgetful creature. This thing, every movie you've ever seen, every television show you've ever watched, every headline you've ever glanced at, every face you've ever noticed in a crowd, it has it all. And when it sits across the board from you and the pieces are displayed, it absolutely surrounds and encloses your mental universe and can manipulate you any way it wants to, because it knows you far better than you know yourself. As an example of this, because it's very hard to catch this thing in action. It's Mercury sly, but it's not perfect. It's not godlike. It's just 99.8% able to do this trick without ever being nailed to the wall for it. Here's an example of the 0.02% where it failed. And if this seems to make no sense to you, you should read my book, True Hallucinations, in which the story I'm about to tell is embedded. But my brother, to shorthand it catastrophically, went pretty bananas in the course of this expedition to the Amazon. And at one point he announced that he was going to deliver a teaching that would, I think this was the one which cured all disease. You only had to do this practice and all physical disease would instantly be cured. And he said, and so here's the practice, he said, picture the number 8, turn it on its side, slide the 2 circles together, shrink it to a point, close your eyes, and utter the mantra, please. Okay? Sounds like it has a 30-40 chance of at least knocking back hay fever, right? So this was at a point in this experience in the Amazon where he had been raving for days and days, and just everybody was exhausted and at their wits' end. But it was like a bolt of lightning to me, because I remembered that 3 months before I had been in Canada, having come from Japan, and was getting ready for this Amazon expedition. And one of the things that I thought I should take care of, since I'd been in Asia for a couple of years, was I needed a dental checkup. So I made an appointment with this Canadian dentist and went for this dental cleaning, and arrived to find a waiting room full of people, and settled down to a tall stack of tattered and incredibly tatty magazines, among which was the Journal of the Canadian Education Society, something like the Parent-Teacher magazine, but for Canada. And there was an article in there that said, this was 1971, shows you how things never change. There was an article about how computers will soon revolutionize elementary school teaching. And so, in desperation, I turned to this article. And here's this article. You can imagine what it was saying. But there was this little sidebar next to the article. And it said, the schools of the future will be nothing like we have known. Children will learn in completely different ways. And then it said, imagine little Susie sitting down in front of a computer screen, visualizing the number 8, turning it on its side, sliding the two circles over each other, and shrinking it to a point in order to command an arithmetic operation or something like that. And it was like, nailed. We know where this stuff is coming from. It's coming from our own minds. He, if we want to blame my brother for this, had apparently a complete readout of all this detritus flowing around in my mind, and could pick it up and use it at will to befuddle and confuse me and lead me deeper in. When I was schizophrenic, if this is what we're talking about, my feeling about it was, and maybe this is, if not true, a delusion worth playing with, is I thought, what we call mental illness, what we call schizophrenia, and what we look into the body or the mind or the personal history or the dream state to try and understand and possibly cure, it's not like that at all. It isn't if you're the person who's nuts, it isn't your problem. It's something that's happened to you. Not more fundamentally than catching the flu. It's like you just happened to step in some cosmic doo-doo, and now it's on the bottom of your shoe, and everybody's pointing at you and backing up, but it isn't your fault. It was just happened to be in your path. It's a kind of, it's a horrible piece of luck, unless you can turn it to your own advantage. And what that means, I think, is obviously integrating it. Well, then how do you integrate these things? I think it has to do, again, a lot with where you start from. Just speaking from my own personal experience, what saved me was my cynicism, that I didn't believe in anything, never had always thought believing in things was a bad idea. So then when this whole cosmos of beliefs was handed to me on a platter, I just simply said, maybe, I'll act it out, but I won't believe it. And I think that had I been a good Mormon, a good Catholic, a good Buddhist, a good something else, then I would have been lost, because I would have traded whatever it was I believed for the new set of beliefs. As it was, I just said, what's this? Beliefs. I don't do that. But I played with it, and somehow the playing with it was able to depotentiate it. I had a conversation with someone very recently who, by ordinary standards, I think would have to be considered nutty as a fruitcake. And, they could hardly speak of their condition without being swept by an emotion that was so intense that it reduced them to tears, And I said, if you're going to be this nuts, you should enjoy it more. It's too... And they said, I am enjoying it. And I said, well, I'm not enjoying it because you're just projecting such an emotional intensity that it makes me very nervous. And I think I speak then for the same general masses about that. What makes it hard for the person who's going through this is that it's so hard for other people. I mean, it's freaky to be around somebody who's crazy. Dennis had this notion of what he called the good shit. This developed in the days after the ideas about hypercarbylation. And he claimed it was like a fantasy, it was like a joke, it wasn't clear exactly what it was, but it was this idea that there was this hash somewhere that had been rolled into cow dung and cut with cow dung and then infected with psilocybin mycelium, so that the mycelium had completely replaced the cow shit in this ball of hash, or this hypothesized kilos of hash somewhere in the world. And so there was this psilocybinated, the good shit. And at one point he envisioned us actually forming a rock and roll band which would play instruments that would condense this stuff out of the air over large audiences. And, we would go on tour, and at the end of the tour, history would be, the whole thing would be in a shambles, because Uncle John's band really did come out of the woodwork. But so at one point, he predicted one night after he had been moved to the river and was sort of in semi-incarceration, he predicted that the good shit would come that night. And so I left with my girlfriend of the time, and it may have even been the same night as the Silver Key incident. And it was pouring rain, and we made our way like a quarter mile, half a mile back into the jungle to this other place where we were staying, where the original experiment had been done. And so then we get to the hut, and it's pouring rain, and I had scored this kilo of Santa Marta gold for the expedition, and we had smoked nothing but this, for Colombia, relatively reg weed for weeks. So I got it out to roll the evening's joint, and I was fumbling with it, and I got this thing lit, and this little crumb, this little burning thing fell on the floor, and I lifted it up and smelled it, and the transubstantiation had occurred. It was, like Mazari Sharif AAA Red Lion hashish of some sort, and I know hashish. And here we were in the center of the Amazon, in this hut, in this pouring rain, and I could tell that it was the good. It was was the good shit. It had actually manifest. And I showed the woman who was with me, who was easily led one way or another, but anyway, she didn't say it wasn't, and I stayed up late that night smoking this incredible hash and waiting for the rain to stop so that at the first gray light of dawn I could go down to the river and confound my critics with, the stone itself, the alchemical quintessence, the concrescence, the excreta bonum, the good shit. Here it was. And so as dawn broke and the fog lifted, I made my way across this rainy pasture and sat down by the hammock of the sleeping form of my most vociferous critic and sort of elbowed her awake. And, there were other instances where this was the principle at work. It didn't work. Everything had returned to normal. It was the Cinderella screw-up, It was just that I was a char girl who washed pots, and there was no prince, and there was no coach, and there was no... And plus I was once again humiliated in the presence of my critics who had further reason to think that a check into the local mental health care delivery system might not be a bad idea. These things happen.